We've just wrapped up week 7 of Mythic Plus, Dragonflight Season 1, which was also the first week of patch 10.0.5. The affixes this week weren't too bad. Fortified, Bolstering, Storming. And we saw the very first, or world first, 27 timed, which was a quarter stars. Lots of people this week have been gearing up alts, or potentially swapping mains after the patch dropped. And a lot of people also getting ready for the upcoming, what looks to be like the push weeks of the season. We have Tyrannical Spiteful Quaking coming up, and the 2 weeks after that seem like they will probably be the best push weeks of the 10-week rotation. That is because we've got the patch that's hit. Most people have the catalyst or are now like getting their optimal 4 pieces, getting all their crafted gear done, fully gearing up, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So after next week, we're going to have Fortified Bursting Explosive, followed by Tyrannical Bolstering Volcanic. This week I have been playing mostly Mistweaver and Discipline Priest. They are the 2 specs that I would say are probably the big winners of 10.0.5 as far as healers go. I've been having a lot of fun playing those 2, and I've also been mucking around a little bit on my kind of 3rd bin tier alt, which has been Resto Shaman, just to try and like have some fun with the amount of damage that they're dealing right now with Acid Rain. In this video I'm going to be going over in a little bit more detail what I've been doing for the week, the builds I've been playing, what I've been experimenting with, how I've been finding the buffed healers that I've been playing, Mistweaver and Disc. And then I'm going to be talking about the healer tier list, how that meta, the healer meta is shaping up, and then finally the dungeon ease tier list. I started off the week continuing to play my caster Mistweaver with the added Shieluns Gift talents, the revival being buffed by 100%, and also the possibility of taking the burst of life nodes to cause Life Cocoon to do the AoE healing rather than the big absorb bubble on a single target. Out of the 3 of those kind of, I guess you would say the big changes for Mistweaver, at least the caster Mistweaver that I play, because the other changes were for Fistweaver quality of life, which didn't really affect me. But out of the changes that did affect the way I play Mistweaver, I was quite surprised at how good Shieluns Gift was. I was expecting Shieluns Gift to be just like more of a burst heal button every minute, 90 seconds, something that I could weave in between or rotate with my Celestial cooldown on a minute as well. But after playing it for a couple of keys, I was really surprised at how often I was using it, like how often there was a damage pattern or occasion where being able to really burst heal 3 targets came up. And when I started tracking and paying much more attention to the stacks as they gained, especially when I was playing with the talent that caused you to gain a cloud every 4 seconds rather than the buff talent, I ended up using it often. And in many dungeons, it was actually my most healing done, which really surprised me. Like I said, I thought it was going to be more of a chunky cooldown that you use not that often, but it made up a big portion of my healing. I don't think it has necessarily increased my overall HPS or my ability to push higher overall HPS, but it has definitely allowed me to react much quicker to certain damage patterns. It's also allowed me to save much more mana because I spend less time casting Vivify, or less mana on Vivify, but also less time casting Vivify, which means I get more globals to do damage. The build I've been playing looks something like this. It's essentially the same build I've been playing and made my previous videos about as a caster Mistweaver, and instead of taking Misty Peaks, I've swapped those 2 points over for Shieluns Gift and the 4-second cloud node. I don't think the talent you take after Shieluns matters too much. I think that really is personal preference. The buff talents I can also see being very, very good. I haven't played around with them much at the moment, but all of the, I know it's RNG, but all of the buffs you can get are good, and they actually also all increase damage, which for some dungeons, particularly the dungeons that I don't end up needing a lot of throughput for, like Azure Vaults, Quarter Stars, Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, where there are a lot of occasions where I'm really just looking for damage. Being able to take the buff talent is a great option there. I haven't played with the Life Cocoon Burst talents much yet, but I do like having that option there for more healing in AoE throughput kind of burst situations. I imagine that will come in quite handy next week on Tyrannical. High Hersias, high Quarter Stars, high Tempest boss or last boss in not good offensive and things like that. I've also noticed the revival buff. Revival is a chunky button to press now. It feels great. I find myself not having to combine revival with another cooldown in order to quickly react to damage, because I was finding that in a lot of situations revival was the button I pressed to buy myself an extra global or 2 or 3, rather than the button I press to get through a healing check. And with the 100% buff, it feels more like the latter than the former, which has been really nice. Towards the end of the week, however, I have been swapping around a lot of my crafted gear and enchants and gems and everything, trying to basically re-gear my Mistweaver around mastery, because I think the potential is there for a slightly different Mistweaver build. I haven't quite ironed out all the quirks of it yet or narrowed down exactly how it's going to play, but I think there is something there now with Shieluns Gift, or because of Shieluns Gift. I think the potential is there for a very, very heavy mastery build. I'm talking like 4,000 plus mastery, all of your other secondary stats going into haste, and I think the potential is there to basically play around two things. The first is that Dragonflight, fist weaving specifically, has enabled Mastery to cause Shiji, the Celestial cooldown, to do insane healing. Now, the way it works is that every time you blackout kick, I think spinning crane kick, tiger palm, whatever, while Shiji is active, you proc a Gust of Mist Mastery heal. Now, in details or Warcraft logs or whatever, it is technically a different spell ID than your usual Mastery, but it is the same thing as your normal Mastery, and it scales with your normal Mastery. Now, what that means is that with Dragonflight being introduced and the ability to stand on a Feline Stomp, press Tiger's Palm, and then press Blackout Kick, if you can cleave 3 mobs at a time, you can effectively get 9 Blackout Kicks on every second global. And that isn't including the other Tiger's Palm initial global. I'm just talking about if you're a Fist Weaver and you have Shiji up, you will proc a Mastery heal 9 times when you Blackout Kick with 3 stacks of your Teachings of the Monastery. Each of those Blackout Kicks will proc a Mastery heal. If you have Essence Font on your party, you'll effectively be proccing 18 Mastery heals just from your Blackout Kicks every 2 globals. I think with the initial Tiger's Palm, you actually proc more like 20 or 22 gusts. So it's like 10 or 11 gusts of mist heals every global. Now, obviously that is an enormous amount of healing, like potentially the highest burst healing in the game, especially in like a Mythic Plus environment or something. Right, Shiji, if you stack a lot of Mastery, is nuts, is the point I'm trying to get across. The problem with this is that when Shiji is down, your general Fistweaver build doesn't want Mastery at all. Doesn't get much value out of Mastery. It actually tries to avoid as much Mastery as possible, stack as much crit, haste, and verse as they can, because they want to increase the damage they deal with their normal fist-weaving abilities that are affected by ancient teachings to get as much healing as they can out of that damage. Now, what Shieluns Gift brings to this equation, I guess, in 10.0.5, is that if you talent for the 4-second cloud, you have the ability to effectively proc Gusts of Mist on 3 targets every 4 seconds. Now, you probably don't want to be casting Shieluns Gift every 4 seconds, but if you need to, that possibility is there. So the build I'm experimenting with or playing around with revolves around those 2 things. When you have your Celestial active, when you have Shiji up, you do ridiculous amounts of healing by stacking Mastery and pressing Tiger's Palm Blackout Kick if you can cleave multiple mobs. And then while Shiji is down, you can lean on your Gust of Mists with Shieluns Gift if you need it on 3 targets, and just using your Renewing Mist, Instant Vivify procs and things like that, along with your normal fist weaving healing if you want to play it that way, to get through the kind of rotational healing until your Celestial is up again. So I don't have any footage for it yet. I haven't been able to try it out in any reasonable key. I've just been pugging a couple of low ones to kind of get a feel for the build, how players try out different talent options and things, but that'll be something I'll be going into further in the next couple of weeks. I just wanted to, in a long-winded way, I guess, point out that I think the possibility is there for some interesting Mastery builds to start emerging for Mistweavers as well. So that's exciting. As far as Discipline Priest goes, Disc is definitely the glow-up healer of 10.0.5. I think they have gone from a healer that was really lacking throughput in a Mythic Plus environment to being still on the low end of throughput, but I wouldn't say lacking. They now have the ability to heal through pretty much anything you can throw at them. I don't know how that's going to pan out at like the tippity top, at like the very high tyrannical Hosiers and tyrannical Tempests and like the extreme ends of healing checks. But so far this week, Fortified, doing 20s, bricking a couple of Pug 21s. Disc has felt great. I've never felt like my throughput or my healing has been the cause of any real wipes other than in situations where I did not play well. The 100% buff to Power Word Radiance is huge. That is now a heal that can be, half your party's health in a single cast kind of realm of healing. And having that on a 15-second cooldown has made a huge difference to Disc's ability to deal with burst or like very quick damage patterns. The build I've been playing with looks something like this. I wouldn't worry about copying my build too much. I've done a few things that are just objectively worse than the conventional builds. Things like taking Phantasm for the fade removing all snare effects I've found to be really handy in some situations. Same thing with Crystalline Reflection for a little bit more spot healing or tank healing. Same thing with Angelic Bulwark, all of these on the class tree. Angelic Bulwark just to have that last little catch-all, maybe it saves your life, safety blanket, even though taking all of those talent points out and instead putting them into the Mind Games branch is probably objectively a better option. More damage, more healing and everything if I play well or perfectly, I guess. A quick side note here, if anyone knows how to stop my mouse or know why sometimes my mouse gets like stuck in the center of my screen and when I move it, it keeps snapping back to the center. If anyone knows what causes that or how to fix it or anything, please throw it in the comments. But I've been opting for a more safe defensive build with a couple of quality of life things. The same goes with me not taking Schism. I think the objective, probably best choice here is to play Schism instead of Painful Punishment. I just really like the dot extension. I like being able to just press Penance on cooldown with my Harsh Discipline buff every time, and I can keep Purge the Wicked up almost indefinitely on a single target and never have to refresh. I find that really fun and enjoyable. I also really like the Purge the Wicked extension that happens automatically when I play that makes up for a little bit of the Purge the Wicked dot uptime I lose from Expiation. I think Schism is a objectively better button to have. I just prefer the quality of life of Painful Punishment. I think there's also an argument to be made for not taking Borrowed Time and instead putting those points into either Schism duration or Rapture duration or Shadow Covenant duration. This disc build focuses more on effectively juggling two things. You are getting a huge amount of your healing out of Power Word Radiance that you have up every 15 seconds. And then outside of that, you're getting basically all of the rest of your healing from Atonement windows. And those windows are going to be based on Mind Blast, and then combining that with Schism if you take it, or Shadow Covenant and Mind Games, Mind Bender, and obviously pressing enough of those buttons along with Smite between your penances to get Harsh Discipline stacks to buff your penance. It sounds pretty complicated, and it actually is quite a few buttons. Disc is definitely suffering from the button bloat that Blizzard mentioned at the end of beta in their blue post, and that is that you have like quite a few healing buttons that you're combining together at the moment and quite a few damage buttons that you're also combining together. And it's a little bit like you're playing the piano when you're healing as a Discipline Priest. I haven't quite decided if this is really something that's worth complaining about or petitioning Blizzard to change. I'm hesitant to streamline Disc too much. At the moment, I think the spec is really fun, and I like having a lot of buttons to push, a lot of things to combine, a lot of decision making in my moment-to-moment rotational gameplay. I like having that. I can understand how it could be a little bit too much, especially if you don't have a good keybind setup or you're playing with every kind of possible extra button talent that you can play with. But I certainly don't want to streamline Disc so much that it feels like Evoker or Preservation, where you can kind of just, everything comes down to one or two big buttons. The mistake I made playing Disc at the start of the week was that I was relying too much on Power Word Radiance. And on paper, Radiance is definitely the way to go, right? It's 410% spell power healing on 5 targets every 15 seconds. That's insane. It's more healing than Holy Word Sanctify, and that's on a minute cooldown. And Disciplined Priests get to press Radiance every 15 seconds, and it doesn't have the kind of positional requirement that something like Sanctify has. It's crazy strong, but it isn't enough. So the mistake I was making is that I was trying to get too much healing out of it, or I was leaning on it too much as a catch-up mechanic when health bars moved and I didn't have anything else to press. But what I like about Disc at the moment is that you need to combine your kind of burst healing with Radiance along with half a dozen other buttons that you need to press in some combination that works in order to get a decent amount of atonement healing as well. So like I said, I can understand the argument to be made that there is a little bit of button bloat. There's too many things going on with Disc, having to use Smite, Mind Blast, Schism, Penance, Purge the Wicked, Mind Games, Mindbender, refresh your dots that get eaten by expiation, build up harsh discipline stacks, use Shadow Word Death, use Shadow Covenant rotationally. Like, that's a lot of things to be doing. Use Solace as well, all at once. But I also think there's an argument to be made that the spec works well with a lot to do. Now, I think because of everything I've just outlined, Disc to me is, or at least it can be, quite a stressful healer. There's a lot you have to manage, a lot you have to track. You can always go back and watch your play and realize that you could have done things significantly better. Not all healers have that. And it's also a healing spec at the moment that requires a bit of balance. And I don't mean like tuning. I mean like you need to balance what you're healing right now with what you're healing or getting prepared for in the next few globals. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But for now, yeah, Disc is it's the stressful healer to me, or at least it can be. My Mistweaver, my casting Mistweaver is the relaxing healer because I can really play it by just watching health bars and reacting to health bars. There's not a whole lot I have to worry about. I can kind of deal with pretty much every damage pattern and play fairly optimally by just using, 1 or 2 or 3 buttons, which is kind of nice. Mistweaver also has a way to get out of bad situations, like recover from mistakes, recover from everyone dropping low very quickly, or to get through difficult healing checks and situations that I think Disc lacks. And that's part of what makes it stressful. Disc has excellent burst AoE throughput with Radiance, but like I said, you need to balance that, or you need to add to that throughput with your Atonement healing. And your Atonement healing comes from windows where you're combining multiple spells together, which are somewhat conditional or can be a little bit delayed. And sometimes, especially when I was under geared, or at least healing content that I wasn't necessarily geared for, AoE healing as a Disciplined Priest to me felt a little bit like bursting with Powered Radiance, Shadow Covenant, Mind Games, Mind Blast, Mind Benders, all that kind of stuff, and then just trying to live long enough, triage heal, to get to the next set of cooldowns where I could burst heal again. As I've gotten more gear and gotten more comfortable with using my cooldowns more liberally, Rapture, Mindbender, Shadow Covenant, Barrier, all those things, when I use them almost on cooldown, Disc has felt a lot better to me. The damage Disciplined Priest brings is also really nice, being able to do 20k DPS or so overall in a key while focusing on healing helps a lot with the timer. And to me, Disc is the only healer that I play where I don't feel like I'm constantly swapping between dealing damage and healing. I'm kind of just always doing one thing. And that has been enjoyable. It's quite fun. If you really want to min-max your damage with this kind of dark Disc build that focuses more on Mind Blast, Shadow Covenant, Expiation, Inescapable Torment, and having your Mindbender up often, especially as you get more haste, you can actually get to a point where you can have your Mindbender up about every 30 seconds and it will last about 15 seconds. So you can get to a point where you have Mindbender up about half the time. And while it's up, every time you Mind Blast or Shadow Word Death, you deal AoE damage with your Mindbender. So if you really want to min-max the damage, you can push more like 30k or even higher overalls, which is really nice. Like I said, there are some dungeons where you don't have to bring that much healing, and what you're really trying to do is just add as much damage to help with the timer as possible. It's also really nice to have Vampiric Embrace back as a cooldown. It's been kind of sitting there in the class tree that hasn't really worked with Discipline for a while, but with the Mind Blast getting 2 charges and the Shadow Covenant buff and the other kind of Dark Disc kind of shadow changes that came through in 10.0.5, Vampiric Embrace is now a proper cooldown. You can either take that or the 7% leech, but Vampiric Embrace it's nice to have an extra button. It's also off the GCD, so you can macro it into something like your Mindbender or even your Shadow Covenant or something if you really want to. Going back to what I said before about Disc, in that it feels like you're having to balance kind of 2 things. You're pressing buttons to heal people now, and you're also pressing buttons to get ready to heal people in the next few seconds. I think that is the reason why Disc favors haste so much, and why Disc really starts to shine when you get north of 25-ish% haste, I think. I'm not there yet, but having the ability to do something as simple as pre-spread your atonements while also spot healing, while using Power Word Shield on cooldown, while using Penance on cooldown, while spreading your Purge the Wickeds. There's so many things you need to be doing at all times. Having a lot of haste just allows you to do them much quicker. You can spread your dots and spread your atonements and get in a good position and do everything you have to do before the damage goes out, and then quickly press the buttons to heal the damage that has gone out through your Atonement healing or your Power Word Radiance, and then have enough time and globals to then prepare for the next set of incoming damage. And for anyone who's just getting into Disc or looking at trying Disc, I would say you're going to have to gear it to a point where I think you probably want a minimum of 20% haste before you can even really start doing that in any kind of comfortable fashion. I think you probably want more like 30, because there are times where you really want to spread your Purge the Wickeds and spread your Raptures on the whole party, and then press your Power Word Radiance, and then go through your whole Atonement window and everything, and it all needs to happen in a set amount of time before the next damage pattern kind of comes out. And I am looking forward to getting more haste so that whole process feels a little bit more fluid and easier to manage. I think a good example of that for me has been this upper ring of Ruby Life Pools. Almost all of these pools have the big, I think it's called Destroyer, the big fire guy, and every so many seconds he's going to cast Inferno. Now, with lacking haste, and especially lacking gear, Disc can feel very weak, or just like a bad healer for that kind of damage pattern. Because there will be times where if you don't have the gear and you don't have the haste, you're not going to be able to prepare for the Inferno and then heal the Inferno and then prepare for the next Inferno. You're just going to be constantly behind and dying to the Infernos going off, because you can't top the team quick enough to give yourself time to prepare for the next Inferno, if that makes sense. As far as the meta goes, this week we've seen Discipline jump up to A along with Resto Shaman. Like I said, these, at least in my opinion, have been the big winners of 10.0.5. The pure conjecture on my part is that I think a lot of people enjoy playing Discipline, and as soon as it's viable, people flock to the spec. That is going to be a lot of the people who were playing Holy Priest, or a lot of the people who were playing Resto Druid, or whatever other meta healers earlier in the season. They saw the changes coming through for Disc, and it's a very fun healer for a lot of people, and people just flocked to it as soon as they could. It's also, Priest in general is one of those healers where, because PI is so good, and it's such a great thing to bring to a Mythic Plus team, that the second either of their Priest healing specs are like really good, they have good damage, good mana, good healing throughput, good cooldowns, all that kind of stuff. As soon as they're viable from a healing standpoint, everyone wants to invite them. Everyone wants their friends to, yeah, I'm going to roll a Priest and I'll PI you when we go and run keys. It's an easy healer for people to swap to. I don't think many people expected Resto Shaman, especially with the memes about Resto not really receiving much love in 10.0.5. I don't think many people were expecting to see it really move much, or at least jump up to where it did this week. I think a huge part of that is that Resto Shaman damage now is very high. It is by far the highest of any healer. I think Resto Shaman's played at a reasonable level I even want to say at an average level, they're going to do more damage than any other healer. Resto Shamans played in a manner that really min-maxes their damage, where they give up some throughput and some quality of life to take Acid Rain, to also take Stormkeeper, to take the Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning buffs, all the everything they can get for damage on the tree. And then they really play around being quite anemic with their healing and just lean heavily into damage. Those guys are doing probably close to double what any other healer is doing. So while their healing may be lacking, their toolkit may be lacking in some other ways, their damage is certainly not. To rein in my hopium a little bit, this has also been quite a good week for damage in keys. Bolstering, fortified, not particularly dangerous affixes or anything that like really makes boss fights difficult. This is definitely the environment where the healer that may struggle the most with high tyrannical bosses can certainly shine. We're going to see how that plays out next week with tyrannical, and I actually think maybe not to the same extent, but I think we could also see discipline run into maybe some difficulty next week with tyrannical. Like I said, it does an excellent job of burst healing, but its overall throughput, especially its tank throughput, single target throughput, spot healing, things like that, aren't particularly great. So it'll be interesting to see how the meta changes or like shifts again for next week just for tyrannical. The increased healing needed to get through the throughput checks, the slightly less emphasis on good trash damage, and the increased ability to be able to stay alive, defensives. I think as the weeks go on, I imagine preservation will increasingly become the de facto push healer, maybe even along with Holy Paladin. I don't think Holy Paladin's gained a whole lot from getting the melee wings buff this week in 10.0.5, but Holy Paladins in general I think are kind of sleeping. Their AoE throughput with the Beacon of Virtue builds is excellent, their burst healing is excellent, survivability is great, their damage is actually quite competitive as well, it's not Resto Shaman level, and their single target damage is lacking a touch, kind of similar to Mistweavers or Fistweavers, but their damage certainly isn't bad. Holy Paladin's probably the next healer I'm going to be looking at getting up and getting into kind of reasonable keys. And a big part of that is just how good Beacon of Virtue looks. That single button, it looks like gets Holy Paladins through a lot of very hairy situations that other healers can struggle with. As far as the Dungeon Ease tier list goes, not a whole lot is changing here. The Halls of Valor nerfs were quite good. It's still somewhat of a difficult dungeon. Persia, Fenrir, and Odin can all be quite mechanic intensive, quite difficult bosses to heal. The time is also quite tight, which makes sense as to why it stays in C tier. I think we are also increasingly seeing the dungeon kind of meta focus more on which keys can be pushed to an extreme level rather than which keys are necessarily bad. Having Algathar Academy, Ruby Life Pools, Azure Vaults, Temple of the Jade Serpent in D and F tiers, I don't necessarily think that's because those dungeons have gotten any worse from where they were last week, even though they've dropped a tier. Some of them have. I think it's actually more because on a somewhat easy or like relatively good push week, especially on Fortified, you get dungeons, the easy dungeons like Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, Quarter Stars, Not Good Offensive. They just become the keys that people push. I would still like to see the timer on Azure Vaults be changed, or it given the Halls of Valor treatment where a couple of the tankier mobs, a couple of the slower parts of the dungeon get some health nerfs or even some count nerfs to make that dungeon more timeable. I actually think Azure Vaults, it's definitely one of the easier dungeons to heal. I also think from a mechanics standpoint, it isn't a particularly difficult dungeon, at least not compared to something like Ruby Life Pools, Halls of Valor even. It's just the timer. It continues to be the issue for Azure Vaults. When I run Azure Vaults, I never worry about my ability to heal it or the group's ability to handle mechanics or kill bosses or anything. It's just the timer. Temple of the Jade Serpent being an F this week isn't a huge surprise. The Shah Courtyard, I think, is the hardest part of the whole dungeon, along with that final Giga Pool before the last boss, and it being a fortified week just makes that whole experience even more of a nightmare than it already was. I think we could even, for some, I guess, fun hyperbole, I would even go so far as to say that if the only thing that changed in Temple of the Jade Serpent was that the last boss got slightly nerfed in the random damage that goes out, and the last trash pack just got removed or like significantly nerfed, so it didn't just completely destroy tanks. Those changes alone would probably take Temple from F to like A or B or maybe C tier, but it would be a significant improvement. That last 5 to 10 minutes of Temple is way harder than the rest of the dungeon combined. If you've made it this far, thank you for getting to the end of the video. I have set up YouTube memberships to my channel if you're interested and want to support more of this content. Thank you for watching, and algorithm stuff.